This is Adam Serwer, and I'm here with Amy Wax, and we're about to do a Blogging Heads in part on based on the very interesting book that Amy just wrote. Why don't you talk a little bit about your book, Race, Wrongs, and Remedies?
Right. I'm Amy Wax from Penn Law School, and I wrote this book, Race, Wrongs, and Remedies, in part as a response to my experiences as a law professor teaching about inequality and race and problems of poverty. And it occurred to me when I was teaching that the way people talk about race, or sort of current dilemma of race in the United States, needed some serious revision. One of the problems I noticed was that anytime anyone wanted to talk about self-help or the role that blacks themselves might play at the current juncture in solving some of their problems, anytime that would happen, someone would raise the issue of blaming the victim, and that would be the end of the discussion. So in trying to sort of break through that and reset the discussion, which I think is really necessary given current realities, I look to remedies law, which I also teach. And remedies law tells us that there is this central remedial ideal of justice, which I think we all feel very deeply, that the wrongdoer, the person who causes the harm, has to fix the harm. And we're certainly in the grip of that when it comes to race. The problem is that the wrongdoer can't always fix the harm, and remedies law recognizes that. The person who kills the child can't bring him back to life. The person who puts out your eye can't put it back in. And there are some instances when, and this I think really does apply squarely to race today, only the victim can wholly fix or wholly assuage the harm that has been done to him. So in the book I say, look, there's nothing inconsistent about recognizing that racism and discrimination have grievously harmed blacks and harmed them in specific ways that we can now see today, and I can talk about that. But it doesn't follow from that white society or society as a whole can now fix their problems. And I think that's very much where we are with race today. Why? Because the big problems that hold blacks back today are not the traditional dilemmas of conventional discrimination, of racism, of slavery, but rather problems with the development of human capital. That's what the social scientists call it, so let me be more explicit. I think the main problems blacks have today are wholesale family breakdown, educational underachievement, which is related to family breakdown, and then also excessive rates of crime, criminality in the community. Put those three together, and I think they are overwhelmingly responsible at this point for the fact that blacks continue to lag behind, have not achieved equality. That is really, I think, what is going on today. Now, the question is, what is to be done about it? And just to make a long story short, in my book I say at this point we've kind of reached the juncture where there's diminishing returns for social policies, social programs, services, all the things that the government claims to be able to do to solve this problem. I think at this point, those solutions have run their course. And these are dilemmas, these are problems that only blacks can solve for themselves. So that's the main thesis of my book. And I should add that I'm not denying that discrimination exists. What I'm really saying, though, is that discrimination has diminished dramatically, and I think there's a lot of evidence to back that up. There's evidence in labor economics, social science, in other areas to back that up. And now discrimination is dwarfed by these other problems, which are self-perpetuating, and cultural problems. They are fundamentally cultural problems that are self-perpetuating.
So I think I thought your book was interesting because I think there's often a tendency. I think a lot of conservatives tend to sort of downplay the effect of past discrimination, and your book obviously doesn't do that. It says, what happened was terrible, and there's no question that it's shaped society in these really fundamental ways, but there isn't really a sort of government-based solution to that problem. Do you think is that an accurate sort of reproduction of your argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of our confusion that we think that my point, which is that government programs, the kinds of interventions that government can make are of very limited usefulness, that it follows from that we're denying that there were these terrible past problems that have really harmed the Black community. I don't think one needs to be connected to the other. And in fact, in my book, I say we really need to radically separate what law would call liability, that is how the harm occurred, and remedy, which is now what is going to solve the problems. So, cause and cure are very separate. It's very hard to keep them separate because the minute we know the cause, we think, well, we know the cure. The cure is to look to the agent of harm. They have to do something, and if they do something, they can solve the problem. And I think that is a real fallacy. It's a rut that we're in, and we need to get out of it.
I actually think that's interesting because I don't really see. I mean, your book to me, one of the things I found interesting about it is that it actually strikes me. I mean, it feels like a book that's talking to, I think, mostly white sociologists or arguing with them about their conclusions about things, about Black people, but it's not, it's sort of, I mean, I guess what one of the interesting things to me is the sort of like self-help ethic that you think is sort of the real solution to the problem. Mm-hmm. That internal discussion happens among Black people all the time. I mean, you mentioned the sort of Bill Cosby,
right?
The sort of the pound cake speech.
Well, my audience, I have a lot of different audiences here. I mean, definitely one of the audiences are what I would call opinion leaders, or what you might call elites, the people who actually shape the discourse, many of whom are academics, but also journalists. I mean, I think this is sort of, this mindset, this rut is, the New York Times, I think, has it bad, and other organs of opinion like that, liberal elite opinion, they just are stuck in my mind. But I also think that, Blacks, although Black people behind closed doors have these discussions, I think they too are stuck in a rut. I mean, because they are very confused about what the real nature of the problem is, and then what the nature of the solution is. So they kind of.
I just think, I think actually, my quibble with your argument about that is I think that conversation actually takes place regularly, and the Bill Cosby speech. I mean, like, people hear that, some variation on that speech. A lot of people hear some variation of that speech sort of every Sunday when they go to church. I mean, one of the reasons it was so well received by the audience is because it's a sort of, it's almost a genre of public speaking in the Black community to say, you have to pick yourself up. It's one of the reasons why, while some liberals were scandalized by Obama's speech, fatherhood speech a couple of years ago during the campaign. Right. The audience received it really well, in part because, I mean, people hear these things all the time. I mean, there is very much a sort of, I think that while a lot of white liberals may talk about Black people as not having agency, I think that Black people generally think of themselves as having agency and talk like they have agency and are actually pretty divorced from this rather sort of academic discussion about whether or not outside forces are shaping everything.
I think there are two things going on that sort of detract a little. No doubt there is that discourse in the Black community, and I'm not denying that, okay? But I think there's two other things going on. First, there's a parallel discourse. There's always, I have a word for it in my book. I say sort of, arguing along two tracks, which is, yes, we have agency, and yes, we have to pick ourselves up, and yes, we have to fix our own problems, but there's all this racism, and there are all these forces arrayed against us, and, white society is against us. We can't really do it. On some level, it's obvious why we're not doing it. Who can blame us? That sort of thing. And so that is definitely going on. I mean, the racism drum is being beat constantly. And so I don't think you can deny that. And it's especially among Black leadership, it is there. It is absolutely there. That is their sort of orthodox approach to everything. The second point is that although, there's all this talk, there's no action. So just to take examples, we have a 73% out of wedlock birth rate, and that's just for starters. And on top of that, a much higher divorce rate than among Blacks and Asians. Just the family has disintegrated. There is wholesale family breakdown. There is very little talk about that. I mean, certainly in journalism, it's verboten. In academia, it's absolutely verboten. I mean, I don't know if it's. I'll give you an example. I had a Black journalist come to my office to interview me, a very well-spoken guy who went to Yale and is clearly very interested in these topics. And I don't know what he studied as an undergrad. I doubt it was physics. I think he's interested in race issues, so it might have been sociology. And he said that he only recently learned that the Black out of wedlock birth rate was 73%. And I thought, what the heck has he been doing? Is this not something they discuss at Yale? It is not something they discuss at Yale. So we have a kind of conspiracy of silence about the truth, okay? The number of Blacks involved in the criminal justice system, there is more energy devoted to denying that Black and white crime rates differ, that Blacks are disproportionately committing crimes, than to actually looking and saying, what are we going to do about it? I mean, so I don't agree with you that, that is the dominant approach of the Black community. It certainly is not the dominant approach.
I think we have
of the leadership. I can tell you that.
I think we have to disassociate between the sort of the like what you might call the approach of people whose sort of job. I mean, like advocates are generally like people who are seeking some sort of government action in redress for a grievance, regardless of whether the issue is racial or not. I mean, there's always. I mean,
right. They want more services, more programs, throw more money at the problem.
Or, I mean, like, even if there was something interesting, there's an interesting document the other day that was released by the NRA about how to talk about, like, gun rights. And it's very much sort of this premised off of this
yes,
framework.
But I mean that counts, Adam. I mean that counts. These are the people. These are the opinion leaders. These are the people who control the media. I hate to get into the whole conspiracy theory thing, but I mean the fact is that the people who control what gets written in the New York Times. I will give you an example. 2 days ago, there's this op-ed in the New York Times by this guy, John Weidman, about how nobody will sit next to him on the Acela because he's Black. And, my view is get a life, but also, so we have the New York Times devoting op-ed space to that, and you will never hear one word about the complete and total collapse of the Black family. That's not something they want to talk about. They'll tuck it in the corner on page 24, latest Census Bureau reports, but it should be front and center at the top of the list. But in polite company, we don't talk about that. Instead, we talk about perceived racism on the Acela Express. I mean, this is fiddling while Rome burns. That's what it is.
I think actually, I mean, Weidman, if it's the John Edgar Weidman I think you're talking about, he's a very very good fiction author, which may be why.
Well, what does that have to do with anything?
Well, I just mean I think generally if you're someone, I mean if you're a literary person, you get sort of a newspaper is more likely to print your op-ed even if it's not a very strong argument. But
the point I'm trying to make a different point here. Which is
right. I understand that, but what my counterpoint is, though, that I actually think, from my perspective, there's an incredible amount of journalism devoted to the perspective of showing Black people and their burden on the state. I mean, the sort of thing that comes to mind is CNN's Black in America, which is almost singularly. I mean, like they've done I think 2 specials, and they're almost singularly devoted to talking about the kinds of issues that you're talking about. I mean, there's actually very little exploration of the Black in America is actually like both of these shows are actually these specials that were, greatly hyped.
Okay, well, I haven't seen them.
Myself. They're almost exclusively devoted to sort of, things that are wrong with the black community. There was very little exploration of anything about being black that didn't have to do with education, out of wedlock birth rate, crime, incarceration rates.
Okay.
I don't know that I agree with you that our conversation is as lopsided as you think it is. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I think it is pretty lopsided, and to the extent that these are addressed, I'm coming from the perspective of academia, where the conversation is wildly lopsided. I mean, it's not even close, and certain things just aren't said. So we talk a lot about racism and victimization and, how social conditions are arrayed against blacks and they can't possibly help it. So there's a whole kind of puppet on a string, rational actor model that takes over there in that discourse. But, to the extent that these problems are addressed, I think it very much, the defect here is in where we perceive the solutions to lie and how these things are going to get corrected. So the immediate impulse is to say programs and services. That is what we need. We need more money, more programs, more services, and that is how we're going to achieve equality. So take, for example, the black-white achievement gap and problems, academic problems. We have all of these wildly interventionist, crash, all-out, incredibly expensive programs being proposed and being ballyhooed and being celebrated, like the Harvard Children's Zone or Friends of Children, this wildly expensive program, $100,000 per child, which essentially, when you come right down to it, it involves replacing the family. It involves giving up on the family and saying, we are going to do for children everything that fathers and mothers are supposed to be doing for children, which is building human character, building capacity, building skills, building agency and executive control from the bottom up. I'd say that's insane. First of all, it can't be done, right? Because what you're doing is you're replacing half of the equation in children's lives. You've got a community where men have pretty much checked out. We have half amount of investment in the next generation that we do in other communities. And I'm talking about the white community, has much better, more stable families. There is no society on earth which has created programs through government that have replaced the family and replaced fathers and replaced the traditional unit for bringing up children. Sir, it's fantasy to think that is going to work. And yet I think that there is an orthodoxy that, this is the way forward. And it's fed into by all sorts of cultural trends. I mean, things like, if you're a good person, you believe in programs and services. And if you say that they're a waste of time, you're bad. You're a Republican, you're a conservative. We have to have something for our kids to do when they come out of their Ivy League colleges. And of course, working for a nonprofit or helping the underprivileged is, what gives prestige. So we're going to keep these programs and services going. I mean, after a point, it's not really about achieving equality for blacks. It's about feeding the vanity of whites, in my view.
I think that's something of an interesting cultural observation. But just to go back, I think I'm not someone who thinks. As to replacing the family, I want to talk about that a little bit later. But I think that one of the reasons that I remain skeptical of the sort of intractability of culture argument is that we've actually seen that before. I mean, you saw it pre-World War II with white ethnics. There's a tremendous amount of sort of psychological and sociological literature at the time explaining that Catholics and Italians are or people who come from old world countries where they have an obedience to authority, and this explains their IQ disparities and things like that.
But you know what? Those commentaries were wrong. Because
right,
what they didn't recognize is that those people came out of Western culture. They had intact families. In other words, they had all the cultural capital that they needed to build
but at the
on.
Time,
but people say all sorts of stupid things that are not right. So I'm saying.
Well, right, but at the time, this was like the prevailing social science, and something happened that something happened. What happened between sort of World War II. Like between pre-World War II and sort of the 1960s was that, there was this incredible, massive effort on the part of the state to push these people into the American mainstream through things like the Social Security Act.
Oh,
programs to promote home ownership.
That is nonsense. These people, by dint of their own efforts, right, went out into the economy and got jobs and stuck to the last. And looked forward to making their children better off than they were. If you're going to attribute the success of, all of these different groups from Europe to the Social Security program, I just don't buy that. I think that is really a kind of wacko, distorted view of history. The government did not make these people successful. The government did not make these people successful. Right?
No, government
programs did not make these people successful.
No, my argument is that government programs helped create conditions under which these people could succeed. And one of the hallmarks of this massive effort by the state to help these people go into the American mainstream, and it wasn't just a matter of Social Security. There was a lot of effort devoted to sort of like creating a sort of sense of American identity, even for immigrants who were, say, going into.
Yeah, you know what that's called? They gave them basic public schools. Public schools so basic that to look at them now, they would seem, out of the zeitgeist. I mean, reading, writing, and arithmetic. I think you're mistaking two fundamentally different things. One is a basic social safety net and the sort of fundamental services that governments provide, including basically good schools, social safety nets for people who are really down on their luck, some support for the elderly. Yes, all of those things should be in place, and they're in place today, with massive, dramatic social engineering. I mean, what's required now is to completely and totally socially transform and re-engineer people, which is radically different from just providing that basic infrastructure, which is what the government. I just blacked out.
But my point
here.
is, there was a time where
Uh-oh.
There was a time where
wait 1 second. My webcam just went off, so now it's back on. Okay, go ahead.
There was a time when sort of there were cultural problems that were seen as similarly intractable, and they weren't. And I think that there's actually, you look at something. Just in terms of changing culture. One of the laws that has had the greatest impact, sort of culturally, on Americans is the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's had a tremendous. Prior to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, there was an incredible amount.
It allowed people by dint of their own efforts to actually make their way. It removed hard and fast barriers. It did not fundamentally re-engineer people from the bottom up.
I'm not talking about black people.
Yeah, it forced people to clear the channels, right? But it didn't fundamentally transform people, give them all of the basic elements they need to function in society.
Actually, what I'm arguing is that it fundamentally changed white people.
I know, but it didn't. But the white people were already grown up. They already had gone to school, acquired skills. They already had, They already had the sort of characterological attributes. I'm talking about building people from scratch. That is what
I'm talking. Right, but I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about the way that the 1965 Civil Rights Act 1964 Civil Rights Act fundamentally altered the way white people looked at race and racism. Where prior to that time, the discrimination just wasn't a lot of people didn't think there was anything wrong with it. And you look at society now.
Well, fast forward. Okay, I got it. But how does that translate into getting black people to, number one, stop committing crimes; number two, stop having children out of wedlock and not getting married; number three, study in school and take school seriously. Those are the three, and just basically, improve their behavior all around so that they can step up and be equal and make their way on their own. This is a very different project. What programs and services, what intervention, what law is going to do that today? Okay, I'll give you, the Civil Rights Act did work a dramatic change. Yes, not in people's characters, but in people's behavior in certain sort of fixed fields, right, which is discrimination in this narrow band of you must stop discriminating at work, in programs. Not necessarily.
No, but what I'm saying is that it evinced a very profound cultural change, which I think your book is sort of arguing that cultural change has gone too far.
No,
in the sense of
I'm
creating,
not. Oh, no. I'm not arguing that it's gone too far.
In the sense that we're too fixated on racism. But there was a time when racism wasn't really a bad thing.
Okay.
Like people didn't look
Adam,
at it
that was then. You're stuck in the past. You're stuck in the past, just like everybody talks about this is stuff. Let's look to the future. What do you propose for the future? To get out of the rut now where we have blacks lagging behind, there's a stagnant situation, right? The family continues to disintegrate. Black children continue to lag. Black incarceration rates and crime rates are sky high. If all of those things could be brought down to the level of the background society of whites or Asians, the black community would be 1,000 times better off than it is today, and 1,000,000 times better off than if we, eradicate all remaining discrimination. So, what is the program?
Right, but I don't think that I number one don't think that that's going to happen if black people clap louder, and number two, I think that to the extent that and this is something I was trying to say earlier, I don't think there's very much public policy that's actually driven by the remedial ideal, despite the fact that our public conversation on race is driven by that concept. I can't think of too many major public policy undertakings in the past 20 years that were, that were sort of geared specifically towards, alleviating this wrong, this wrong that was racial wrong that was done in the past.
I think the obsessive hunt for discrimination in every corner and under every bush, to the detriment of squarely facing where the problems are and what's really holding blacks back, I think that is fueled by the remedial ideal. I call it the myth of reverse causation, because discrimination caused this problem. Getting rid of discrimination is going to solve it. And I think we are in the grip of that delusion, for sure. And that comes out of the remedial ideal.
The thing is we have the Civil Rights Act. I'm not sure. Liberals are fundamentally, liberals think that, there are certain areas of life in which, government should intervene to make things better for people. And you often see stuff like, with the Affordable Care Act that just passed, you see people making arguments like this, because a large proportion of the insured are minorities, this will help minorities. But, liberals would be proposing this if it would have been proposing sort of a universal healthcare insurance system, whether or not, if there were, as long as there are 40 million uninsured, liberals would be saying, look, we need to insure these people regardless of whether or not they were mostly black or mostly Hispanic or mostly white.
Well, but this, I don't see the relevance of this. I don't see the relevance of this because fixing the medical care system is a separate problem. But the problem I'm addressing is the problem of group inequality. Group inequality. What does group inequality mean? It means when you set out the bell curve for behavior across many domains, right? Educational attainment, jobs, earnings, family structure, criminality. When you set out those curves for one group, right, it lags way behind another group. That is what I mean by continuing inequality. that is the problem that blacks are, that is what they're complaining about. And so what my book is really about is, how does the problem of inequality, group inequality, we're not talking about individuals, because obviously individuals are doing extremely well in every group. I'm talking about demography is destiny, right? How do we change those demographic patterns so that the rate of failure and success in each group is more or less similar? And that's when blacks will be equal. I mean, that's the goal. I take it. I don't know. How would you define the goal?
I think that I'm less skeptical than you that government is capable of realigning incentives in a particular way in order for people to make rational choices that don't put themselves in those kinds of situations. Like to say that it's culture and there's nothing we can do about it.
No, I didn't say I think it can be solved. I don't think there's anything the usual levers of policy can do about it. That is a very different proposition. I think the people themselves could easily solve the problem tomorrow at no cost. Because there's human freedom, right? There's human freedom, and people can see that what they're doing is radically dysfunctional. I think it requires the black community to see that the way they're progressing is radically dysfunctional, and they're only hurting themselves by continuing to behave in these ways. But they're not there yet. And even if they've got the realization, they're not translating it into action. Okay?
Well, I think, the point is that I think, I suppose I'm one of the people you're criticizing in the beginning in your book who argue that people basically make rational decisions based on their surroundings. I think there's a lot of evidence that that doesn't necessarily mean people make good decisions. But I think the current situation is a reaction not simply to culture, but to the set of choices that people have in front of them. And I think there is,
I just do not think that is right if you mean it in any deterministic sense, right? So take the choice to get married, right? We have data that shows that even when you control for income, control for education, so take, 3 men, 1 black, 1 Asian, 1 white, same job, same income, same education, right? The black man is about half as likely to get married and is many times more likely to have a child out of wedlock and have multiple children by multiple women out of wedlock. So the economic constraints are not dictating this behavior, that's for sure, okay? Now, if you're going to say, well, it must be the cultural milieu, or, well, now we're into culture. All right, now we're into attitudes. I'm sorry, my webcam just went off again. Here we go.
Now we're jiggle your mouse a little bit.
Yeah, I got to jiggle my mouse. Okay, I've got my mouse jiggled. Now we're sort of out of the realm of being able to predict lockstep which conditions are dictating this behavior. You have no choice but to do this. How can anybody expect you to do otherwise? That just doesn't pass the smell test. It doesn't comport with the data, doesn't comport with the reality, right? That people sometimes do make bad decisions. Some people are, I think, not making the right decisions. Hello?
Yeah, I wasn't trying to suggest that people don't make bad decisions. I just think there are very rare circumstances in which people make decisions that are completely irrational. And I will say that.
Well, what do you mean by irrational? I think that people make plenty of decisions that are self-defeating and self-destructive, right? And I can just point to those decisions. They're everywhere. So sure. I think the decision to have a baby, out of wedlock might be rational for the individual. For the group, it's a disaster.
Right. But most people don't think about.
We can bring, game theory in here.
Whether it's rational for the group.
Okay. Well, they ought to. All right, especially here, this is a good point. If people are going to make decisions that are good for them and then turn around and complain that their group is lagging behind, and why is our group lagging behind? It must be that somebody's doing something to us.
I think
my answer would be you're doing it to yourself, and there is a coordination problem here. There is a big coordination problem here.
I think it's sort of asking people to look at themselves in a way that's somewhat unnatural. I mean, I don't...
But what's the alternative, Adam? I mean, fine. It's asking people to look at themselves in a way that's unnatural, and then, you know what? If they don't do it, they're not going to get ahead.
Well,
there will be no equality.
It's not like higher rates of two-parent families among whites and Asians are the results of white people saying, oh, you know what, if I have a baby out of wedlock, that's going to make white people look bad. I mean, that's just fun. I mean, that's not why that happens.
It's not a matter of looking bad, okay? It's a matter of there being dominant norms in the community which make it clear, right, that both as an individual and on the whole, this is the best way forward. Now, you're right. Upper middle class whites who still overwhelmingly live traditionally when it comes to family, they sort of live the 50s but talk the 60s, they are sort of doing it out of cultural habit. That the cultural script is there. They see everybody around them do it. They do it. Right. So they're not thinking about it consciously. Yes, that's good. That is what's happening right now. So you're saying, well, the fact that blacks are surrounded by very different choices or very different cultural norms or conventions means they can't get themselves out of it. Here's my response to that. It's hard.
I actually don't think that that's true.
Well, you know what it requires?
I don't think that they can't get themselves out of it.
It requires a conversion experience. It requires, I think the black community coming to a point where they are saying to themselves, what we are doing is not working. The way we are living is not working. In an era in which the future challenge is to build human capital, right? That is how people succeed. That is how groups succeed. That is how groups take their place in American society. We are not doing a good job of building the human capital of the next generation. We have a wholesale abandonment of the next generation on the part of the men in our community. Right. So if we want to build human capital, and that relates to criminality and that relates to underachievement, we have got to change direction in a radical way. I don't see that is where they are right now.
I mean, like this whole question of a conversion experience. I mean, have you seen any group of people in history decide collectively as a hive mind to do a particular thing and focus on it, and therefore, I mean, I just think that's a really weird concept. I mean, I think that what history has shown, is despite, certain, disparities between ethnic groups, is that understanding the problem can sometimes allow government to create the conditions for people to succeed despite history.
Okay, well, what do you propose as an alternative? I mean, you've talked about Social Security and the Civil Rights Act. What's the equivalent today?
I think that's a good question. I think that one of
you don't have an answer. You do not have an answer to that question.
Amy, I don't know why you keep interrupting me in that way. When you ask me a question, I'm trying to answer you, but you tell me I don't have an answer before I actually get to finish my sentence.
All right.
I think that you talk about deficiencies in human capital, and I think one of the ways in which government has actively contributed to sort of deficiencies in human capital is something you sort of skip over in your book, which is the war on drugs. I mean, what's happened is you have a situation in which the way we've dealt with the drug trade and it's not, and the way we chose to deal with it wasn't irrational. Like the drug trade is very violent. We thought, we'll give people longer sentences. We'll go at these people with paramilitary police. We'll do all these things. But what we fundamentally created is a situation where all these men are coming back into a community having been socialized into having acquired social skills that are like almost directly antithetical to holding a job.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
In effect, you're saying, let's legalize drugs, and then all of these guys who are off in jail, creating mayhem and havoc, whatever, that if we're talking about the black community, they're going to all come home and get married, be great fathers, be upstanding citizens. It's going to work a radical transformation in the entire way of life of the community. I actually ran that by a judge once. I said, well, gee, if we could wave a magic wand and all these guys who are involved in the drug trade, we could just let them out of jail and say no more incarceration. Our incarceration rates are too high. No more jail for any drug-related activity. I said, do any of these guys, are they even remotely interested in being conventional fathers and conventional husbands? Is there any prospect of that? Do you think it's related at all to the drug war, that this is not on their radar screen? And he says, of course not. They wouldn't be any better if we legalized drugs. They wouldn't change their behavior in that respect.
I think that's actually a terrible idea. I'm not an advocate for full legalization of drugs. What I'm saying is that I think that conservatives or liberals often try to do too much with government, but I think one of these specific arenas that focusing on could yield a dramatic improvement is on how we deal with people coming back from prison, who tend to be concentrated in these neighborhoods, who tend to bring, who themselves are socialized in ways that are antithetical to keeping a job, who, sort of help perpetuate certain harmful cultural norms.
You're telling me about the problems. You're not telling me about the solutions. How do we solve this problem?
What I'm saying is that the area of public policy that we need to focus on as far as inequality, I think the most important one in terms of racial inequality is on reentry, is on how we deal with people who come back from prison.
Can I say something about reentry? Can I address that? Okay.
Sure.
Reentry. When I was growing up, in the 50s, if you had told my parents that, people coming out of jail, people who committed felonies, we shouldn't be discriminating against them in labor markets. Employers shouldn't even know that they've committed crimes, right? It doesn't matter. You've paid your debt to society, and therefore what we need is to do something to make sure that these people can come back into the community and, be good workers and find jobs and all. They would have laughed at you. They would have said, well, this is common sense. Someone who commits a felony is not going to be considered a desirable worker by any normal private businessman. This is just... I
think if you had told your father at the height of the 1950s that America would, in 2010, imprison more people than communist China, or more of its population than communist China,
I don't think it would have had any influence on them at all. They would have said, if you commit a felony, of course people are going to be suspicious of you. Of course they're not going to trust you. Of course they're not going to want to hire you.
Sure, but I'm actually not saying, we should prohibit discrimination against ex-felons in employment. What I'm saying is that it's a fundamental, you can't say on the one hand, we have these deficiencies in human capital and that's the problem, and then say, but we shouldn't do anything.
What are we going to do?
Anything within our power.
What are we going to do?
To alleviate it? Well, one of the things I would point to is, have you heard of Mark Kleiman?
Yes.
Well, Mark Kleiman recently wrote a book, When Brute Force Fails, that was actually, it's really interesting about, and part of it about sort of the criminal justice system. And one of the things he identified was this parole probation program called Hope in Hawaii.
Right. And, immediate punishment for any probation violation, right in the can, right in the slammer. Okay?
Right.
And that reduces recidivism, but it doesn't change the fact that this person is marked. Right? This person is marked.
It doesn't change that he's marked, but there's ways in which focusing on something minimal is not recidivating creates the conditions for someone to say, well, I can't go back to jail, so I can't go back to selling drugs, which means I'm going to have to keep a decent job, which means, there's a way in which focusing on this one small aspect rather than trying to say, we need to give these people this, and this, but rather focusing on something small like we have to keep them from going back to jail.
I'm all for it.
Actually-
I think if it works,
actually-
we should do it. But I am saying
Right, I mean, but
it
what I'm saying is that
going to change
it-
things fundamentally.
What I'm saying, though, is that I think like something like that can result in someone making such different choices that and we spend so much money on locking these people away that it just seems to me that something like that, where it's fairly obvious, like there's not a whole lot of cost to it, but it can have a tremendous impact on an individual who tends to discount. Who's the kind of person who like lacks a certain amount of human capital, tends to discount the future implications of present actions. That I mean, like it's obvious. It seems obvious to me from that experiment that there's a way in which, by focusing on small things, we can realign incentives in a way that makes people make much better choices.
Okay, well, it's certainly worth trying, and I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Can we really make a significant impact on crime rates through a program like that? I am going to be initially skeptical, but I'm open to the demonstration. I will only say that the programs I've seen, and there are multiples, and I think, Kleiman's idea is perfectly good. I think what he's claiming for it in terms of taking, crime rates that are 8, 9, 10 times the rates in other groups, and really bringing them down to the level where there is equality is massively exaggerated. I mean, the problem will still be there. And I think it's easy to get bogged down in, we've shown some kind of ameliorative effect versus what is the magnitude of that effect in light of the huge magnitude of the problem. I mean, we have here a situation where 97% of the gun violence in New York City 2 years ago is Black or Hispanic. I mean, we have just enormous disparities, disparities. And you're saying a small adjustment in probation protocols.
No, I'm not saying that solves the problem. I'm saying that there are ways. I think what's promising about it is that there are ways to deal with to align incentive for government to align incentives better by focusing on small things rather than by trying to solve a big, huge problem all at once.
Well, but we're not really. I think I'm not really here to dispute that the government can do small things. I'm not here to dispute that, the education system can't be improved or that, government can't be better or anything like that. I wouldn't ever dispute that. I'm saying there's a world of difference between that and the kind of hope, the rescue fantasy of social engineering that I think is at play in many of the proposals and just in the whole discourse. About race. We still have a problem, more money, more programs, more services, and less discrimination, and then that problem will be solved. And we really don't want to be talking about all the bad choices and dysfunctions that are fueling all of this every day.
Well, I don't really have a problem with talking about bad choices. I'm just skeptical of the idea that the answer to people making bad choices is to tell them not to make bad choices. I think that kind of finger wagging is ubiquitous. I think it's all over the place. I think it's been there I think as long as there's been a problem that has existed, and I think that it has even less of a track record as far as changing people's behavior than, so-called social engineering.
Well, there's a third option, right, besides these little government tweakings and just inveighing against people and sort of, wagging your finger and telling them to make better choices, which is to look to the fundamental institutions of society, the arrangements, the norms, the understandings, look back in time, right, to the kind of bourgeois verities that created people who made better choices. And I think it's those that we've kind of pushed to one side because it's not hip and cool to talk about the bourgeois virtues. It's not cool to talk about traditional families Instead, we're talking about family diversity. That's the sort of
but I
cool
think
thing to
that's
talk
actually
about.
the opposite of true. I mean, like when you have the liberal, the liberal who's running for president of the United States saying, "Hey, it's really important for fathers to take care of their kids, and by the way, you need to stop having so many." I think that means that sort of stigma, maybe in the mid '90s or something that was true, but the liberal black president of the United States is saying stop having so many kids and take care of the ones you have.
Well, he's not saying get married. Actually, he doesn't mention the word marriage. The word marriage is verboten. Okay.
Well, that's another interesting part of your book where you sort of say that the marriage problem could be solved if everybody just decided to marry the father of their child or something like that.
Well, it's a little bit oversimple, but look, upper middle class white people do it. Think about how they live their lives, right? How many, really, if you look at the demography, what percentage of children born to white women with a college degree or more in 2009 were born out of wedlock? Less than 5%.
I think we should.
So how are they doing it? I mean, how are they doing it? They're somehow doing it.
I don't think they're doing it because they're,
I'm just saying they are doing it, though. They are doing it. It's not like it can't be done. How come they're doing it? How is it possible that they're doing it? It shows that it's not that hard to do. In other words, and in fact, look back 60 years ago. Look back 60 years ago. Look back. And you will see that the marriage rates among the working class and the middle class and the upper class were the same, right? So now what we've had is this wild divergence in marriage rates. So you cannot look at the present and say, well, the fact that there's these social class differences in marriage rate shows that to get married, you need money. Unless we look back and see that not so long ago, you didn't need money to get married. In fact, the idea was that you got married and that helped you build a life and build prosperity, right? So
sure, but I think you're discounting the way that coming from a higher socioeconomic background actually really shields one from the consequences of making bad decisions. I mean, one of the things you keep mentioning things like criminality. I mean, like the fact is, I'm the child of a fairly privileged biracial family, but I went to public school in D.C. and I didn't know what powder cocaine looked like until I went to I went to a northeastern liberal arts college. I mean, white people actually use drugs at higher rates than black people do, but they don't get arrested for it. I mean, there's a certain amount of
But they don't deal drugs on the street and turn their neighborhoods into armed camps, okay?
Right, but it
is a radically different thing. Whites use drug as much as blacks do, and therefore they ought to be in jail as much as blacks. Is just
no. I don't think anybody should be in jail for using drugs.
Or ought to be convicted as much. They're not.
I don't think they should. I think that nobody should be in jail for using drugs in the privacy of their home. But I think it's a bad idea.
I'm saying I think that what you have to recognize is that the kind of drug dealing that destroys communities is far more common in the black community, right? Now, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it more common because it's more common, or, why is it more common?
Sure, I'm not disagreeing with that. What I'm saying is that I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of the sort of inherent virtue of saying, this group of people who are wealthier and make better decisions do it because their culture is superior and not because they actually have a very different set of choices in front of them.
I say it's because their culture is superior, okay? People come as immigrants off the boat with nothing in their pocket, all right? Absolutely nothing. And they leapfrog ahead of blacks that have lived in this country for centuries. I mean, that is a fact that happens every single day, right? So the notion that there are material or economic constraints that account for all of this is just bunkum. I mean, it's really spurious. It doesn't pass the smell test.
I don't think that. I think you know, I think that it suggests that it's not the only problem.
It isn't. It cannot be the problem because there are people who have nothing. All right.
I don't think it means it's not a problem at all. I just think it means it's not the only problem.
It makes things harder, but it is certainly not the determinative factor because people overcome it every day. This is an opportunity society in which, you know, I mean, I don't want to get anecdotal here, but I come from a working class family. My upbringing was austere by any measure. It wasn't, we didn't live in poverty, but it was very simple. My children would be appalled, my pampered children, to see the way I was brought up. Luckily, they don't have to experience it directly. I mean, it just doesn't compute to say I went to the most basic public schools, nothing special at all. Okay. Now, I was rich in endowment of my parents, you know, their culture, their outlook, their attitudes. I was very lucky in that respect. But that just shows that those things are so important, right? I think
I'm not disagreeing with you that they're important. I just
they're determinative. They are determinative, all right?
I mean,
look back. Look back in time. Look back 50 years ago. Look back 100 years ago, right? People lived in material circumstances that were starkly deprived compared to ours, starkly deprived. And yet they made their way through life. They obeyed the law. They improved themselves. They formed families and by and large stuck with those families. I'm not saying that there aren't people who fall off the wagon, there isn't divorce, there aren't failures, because wherever there's human life, there's failure. But there's a difference between a lapse and a way of life, right? They had strong norms. They recognized when people deviated from those norms. What we have today in the Black community is just the absence of those norms, the absence of them. It's the tipping phenomenon, right? It's a world of difference. And the material circumstances are a small part of it.
I mean, so I mean, as long as we're getting anecdotal, I come from, you know, I come from a, you know, a fairly privileged middle class background. But I actually, you know, talk about culture and norms. I got into a great deal of trouble as a teenager, and I was sent to a youth program in South Central Virginia, which was it basically changed my life. Like I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm not sure what direction my life would have taken had my parents not made that intervention. And for me, and I was unique in that I was one of the few children there who came from the type of family that I came from, a two-parent middle-class family. And, you know, so I went out of there, I left there, and that program was mostly, you know, it was mostly, you know, poor white kids from Southern Virginia. And then I came back to DC, and I went to public school, and, you know, to this day, you know, I think out of my four male best friends from high school, until recently, I was the only one who actually graduated from college. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's because, you know, I don't think that it's a coincidence that that's because I'm from a, you know, middle-class two-parent family, but I don't necessarily, I've never thought of it as like the superiority of my cultural norms. When I messed up,
you should think of it
when
that
I
way.
messed up, I had my parents were
I'm
able
sure it
to
made
catch
the
me
difference.
in a way that their parents were not able to catch them because, you know, one of my friends' parents, you know, one of my friends, you know, his dad is dead. His mother was on drugs. I mean, there's a tremendous, I mean, like, there's a way in which, like, basic economic factors shield people like, who grew up in families like mine from the consequences of terrible, terrible choices.
Well, you're calling it economics, right? The fact is that you did get into trouble, that you could have continued to be in trouble and gone down the wrong pathway, right? And all the money in the world would not have prevented you from doing that. What your parents did for you was they were there to create a structured, stable home, which in the end, that base that they gave you did tell, and you eventually straightened out. Now, you know, we can get into anecdote, but the fact is demography is destiny, and we need to look at the patterns overall. And when we look at the patterns overall, what we see is that even when you control for money, economic circumstances, all of that, we see blacks lagging behind. So take families making more than $70,000 a year. Blacks are still 200 points behind in the SATs. Even that's not a money problem, okay? Their rates of crime are higher. Their marriage rates as adults are far lower. So money is not doing it. Right? It's a set of habits, outlook, cultural norms that just keep perpetuating themselves irrespective of money. And in part, affluence comes out of those norms rather than being a kind of antecedent of them. So which is cause and which is effect, it's often hard to separate those. Anyway, we've gone on a long time here, so I think we should probably
we have. Like I said, I enjoyed your book. Obviously, we disagree on a lot of stuff, but thank you for a very interesting discussion.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, take care.
Bye.